Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when or where you're watching the live or recorded version of this webinar. I'm going to give, say a minute to give everyone an opportunity to join, and then we'll go ahead and kick it off and get started. Alrighty, with that, we are at our 60-second mark, and so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hi, everyone. Really excited that you've joined us for this webinar on customizing your open source license compliance policies, featuring the IP attorney extraordinaire, Heather Meeker. My name is Cortez Frazier Jr., and I'm a product lead here at FOSSA. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Before I go over our agenda and introduce Heather, I'd like to cover some housekeeping rules. First, we will have a few minutes at the end for a brief Q&A, so please post any questions that you have in the question section of your BrightTalk console. Next, this webinar is being recorded. It will be sent out to you after the event. And finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with you after the webinar with a few additional resources, including contact information for Heather, and to see if there's anything that we can do to help your organization with license compliance. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at today's agenda. Broadly, our discussion is going to focus on four primary topics. Of course, we're going to do introductions. We're going to define some terms there, and then we're going to jump into some factors that you'd want to consider when developing or updating your compliance policies. How to interpret and think about compliance policies, how to efficiently and successfully implement compliance policies, and then, of course, the hot topic subject of the month, I would say, how to approach license compliance for code created with generative AI, like ChatGPT or GitHub Copilot. Then, like I mentioned, once we complete this presentation, we'll have time at the end for a quick Q&A. So continue to flood that chat with any questions that you have. Now, before I introduce Heather and we get into the meat of the presentation, a quick final word for the folks who are not familiar with FOSSA. We provide technology that helps a variety of organizations manage their use of open source software. Specifically, businesses use our products to identify and comply with open source software license compliances, including automating the implementation of your compliance policies. We also support other important areas relating to using open source and a safe and secure manner. That's going to be things like vulnerability mitigation and remediation, as well as software bill of materials management. Now, with that said, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Heather Meeker. I suspect many of you on this webinar may be familiar with Heather, but for those who aren't, she is one of the lawyers who has really shaped modern open source license compliance. Heather offered the go-to book on the subject and has worked with numerous companies on compliance-related matters, including FOSSA, where she's helped develop the rules and policies section of our product. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Heather. And to start, I'm wondering if you might be able to share a little bit more about your background, your connection with open source, and some of your current projects.
Sure. Hello everyone and welcome. I'm happy to be doing this webinar today. I hope you find it useful. I came to open source because many years ago, it's embarrassing the number of years ago, I worked as a computer programmer so long ago that we called ourselves computer programmers instead of software engineers. So we've been in the business for a long time. After I went to law school, I was interested in software licensing, and that's really what I've been doing my whole career as a lawyer. So practiced as a lawyer in private practice for many years. And I kept focusing more and more on open source licensing because it's interesting and it's been growing so much during the time I've been practicing. And then in the last 4 years or so, I've also moved into a venture capital role. And I'm a partner at a venture capital fund that invests only in early stage commercial open source development. So now I'm approaching open source from both a legal point of view and a business point of view. And I remain very interested in it.
Excellent. Thank you for that beautiful background. And obviously, we're very, very thankful to have you here to impart some of this knowledge that you're able to give from both perspectives. Before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes from a question perspective, we do have these definitions of some terms that you'll hear throughout the webinar that we want to make sure we define for our audience. Heather, do you want to kick us off with the first couple of definitions?
Sure. So when we talk about policies, what we mean are the rules of the road for ingesting open source software that's written by other people into your organization. And a lot of what you do with open source compliance is try to come up with simple rules to enable engineers to tell whether they have potential compliance issues for the licenses, and also to provide some functionality to help them comply. Another important definition that you we usually hear in the questions, and it comes up a lot, is distribution. So most open source licenses have requirements only if you distribute the software, and distribution generally means transferring copies to others. So what that means is that mostly for software as a service, that does not involve distribution. There are some elements of software as a service that involve distribution, but if you're running software on the back end and merely allowing people to interact with it rather than actually giving them copies, that's not distribution. So we'll be referring to distribution in this presentation, and also it just comes up a lot in the topic of open source compliance. Next is edge computing. This is a technological development rather than a licensing, quality. But edge computing has changed where processing occurs. So you can have systems where instead of a central data center that runs software, computing can take place in all sorts of places. And this obviously can bear on questions like distribution when you deploy software in this manner. Examples of edge computing would be things like point of sale systems and so forth, things where you've got real-time processing that needs to take place in lots of places. Containerization is another concept that comes up a lot these days. Containers are ways to package software. They can be distributed or not, but ultimately they usually don't have much bearing on open source compliance. It's just that containers will kind of smush a bunch of software together and deliver it as a unit. But when we examine things like how code is integrated in order to comply with licenses, packaging and containerization is usually not that important. It's just that it can get confusing to when people come to you with questions about containerization and how it affects compliance. Dependencies are, if you're doing open source compliance, you'll hear about this all the time, and it's worth saying what it means. Although I would say there's not one, specific definition of it. People use this differently, but the idea is that, engineers might select an open source package to use, and then that package in turn calls a lot of other open source packages. And so instead of having one package under one license, you can end up with 100 packages under a whole bunch of different licenses. And also sometimes people refer to direct dependencies that are explicitly declared, and sometimes transitive dependencies, which it can mean that the dependency is not specifically declared. So it's important to understand that when you use an open source package, that can end up implying that you use a whole bunch of other open source packages too. And then finally, dynamic versus static linking. Um, this is a topic that actually causes a lot of confusion. Um, this is a concept actually in certain kinds of programming languages and not in other kinds of programming languages. So uh, that's one of the reasons it gets confusing. In what we call low-level coding, which is, like C++ or languages that have a lot of control over the hardware environment. As a programmer, you can choose how to integrate code, and dynamic versus static linking are two different ways to integrate code just very quickly. Static linking kind of pushes everything together into one big binary blob. And then dynamic linking allows you to write a program so that some code is loaded and used only when necessary, and then is flushed out of memory when not necessary. And really, this topic relates mostly to the lesser general public license only, because it doesn't end up mattering too much for the other licenses. So I know those are a lot of definitions, but hopefully that will make it more helpful to understand the discussion.
Absolutely. No, I think that was a fantastic overview. And one of the things that really stood out to me is your very first definition on policies, and you use this term "simple." That ultimately policies should be simple and easy for your developers to follow. And I think that is a great segue into our first topic. And so, Heather, I'm very curious as to what rules would you recommend organizations implement, starting with, say, for like a SaaS platform.
Well, so first, the rules for SaaS can be different from the rules for distributed software. So when I say that, what I mean is, let's say you have some software that's primarily going to be deployed over the internet, allowing people to interact with the software, but not actually delivered to people, which is usually called an on-premises product. So an on-premises product is mostly distributed, and what that means is that you're going to have to adhere to all of the conditions of the open source licenses. Most of the conditions, like notice requirements, attribution requirements, source code sharing requirements, are triggered by distribution. So then if we look at SaaS, what actually happens is that most of the software never triggers any of those requirements. Now, for SaaS, there can be some code that gets executed client side. That's usually HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so you have to be careful about that. And then also, many SaaS systems have mobile applications associated with them. Those are always distributed. So, but when we say SaaS, we're mostly talking about the kind of deployment where the software never gets pushed out to the user. So because of that, and because most open source licenses don't really have any requirements for SaaS, you can afford to be a little bit more like liberal with your policies about SaaS than you can with distributed products. That just underscores that the creation of a correct policy is all about the context and all about your risk tolerance. Um, I should explain that there is kind of a nuance to this that everyone should understand if they're trying to do compliance for SaaS, and that is that um, most SaaS products end up getting distributed one way or another. So, I've had many clients in my legal practice who have said to me, "We will never distribute this software. It's only SaaS." And then the next day, they come to me and they say, "We have this deal in the offing, and it's a really big deal. And there's just one hiccup to it, which is that our customer needs their own on-premises instance of this." And that can be because for regulatory reasons, security reasons, there can be situations where the use of software can't go over national boundaries. Things need to be air gapped, and so forth and so on. And so You can set a more liberal policy for SaaS because, in a sense, you could just say, well, we're never distributing this. So as long as we only use licenses that have conditions based on distribution, we can do whatever we want. But you can then paint yourself into a corner. So I don't recommend that you go too far on the liberal side with SaaS just because you want to future proof what you're doing. But fundamentally, the licenses like GPL and LGPL and similar copyleft licenses like Mozilla and Eclipse, even if you change that code and you use it just for SaaS on the back end, you will not have to do any source code sharing. And then for GPL and LGPL, you won't have to worry how the code is integrated, which is one of the qualities that controls how you do compliance with GPL and LGPL. So you can go very liberal on SaaS, but I don't usually recommend it for everybody. That's a situation where you can cause yourself a lot of engineering costs if you suddenly have to do distribution.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up a little bit on that, Heather, because I think you really unpack a very nuanced difference between SaaS rules and obligations versus those on the distributed side. And so, as you lean into this liberalness, right, that you can obviously take on the SaaS side, does that mean that teams should just not track code or licenses at all if they're not distributing the software? Or are they kind
Yeah,
of digging a hole for themselves? Yeah.
you should never not track things. Even if you don't have any compliance requirements, you will someday need a software bill of materials. And where technology has been going in the last few years is that there's more and more focus on transparency with software bill of materials. Because always remember that whenever you have license compliance issues, you always have potential security issues too. So at a minimum, you have to track things because of security. It's not a good idea to have products where you don't know the software bill of materials. And so, people sometimes have the tendency to say, well, tracking this stuff is very difficult and time consuming, and I don't want to do it because, excuse me, because it's a lot of work. But that's not a good idea because you will find yourself someday in a situation where you don't know what your bill of materials are and are and that's going to cause you some problems. So even if you don't have license compliance issues today, you might have them down the road. And also, you just are going to have to be responsible and figure out what your software bill of materials is.
Absolutely. And as a previous cybersecurity professional, I do want to make sure that I totally echo what you're saying. I think from a cybersecurity side, your side, from a lawyer side, I think any risk professional, we want to know what risk exists, whether we decide to action on it or not. And so you need to have that accurate software inventory, so that way you can, deal with those. Um, Heather, I think we spent a lot of time obviously on SaaS and distributed models. Are there any like additional nuances within distributed models, such as mobile apps specifically?
So mobile apps, first of all, are always distributed. So they're kind of in the highest risk category of product. Um, just by definition, they have to be distributed to the mobile device. There is another issue, which is that in some of the platforms, uh, it can be hard to comply with licenses like GPL and LGPL for mobile apps. In particular, LGPL has a rule that if you use it's a license for libraries. And so if you use the library in a proprietary application, that's fine. But the license is much easier to comply with if you use the library as a dynamically linked library. This is where this definition of linking comes in. It's really the only place it comes in open source licensing. Uh, but in some platforms, it's actually not possible to do dynamic linking in mobile. By the way, I'm given to understand that that's changing, but it but generally, you're not going to want to use GPL or LGPL software, or really much of any copyleft software in mobile apps. It's just much more difficult to comply with, to do source code offers and so forth, because you're going through a store, right? You're going through the Apple Store, the Google Store, etc. There are also some people, by the way, who think that it's impossible to comply with GPL or LGPL in, say, the Apple Store. I don't happen to agree with that, but I do agree that it's difficult to comply with those licenses in mobile apps. So, for a policy for mobile apps, I would recommend no copyleft software at all. And you might allow some on a case-by-case basis, but you should not set an expectation with engineering teams that they're going to be able to use copyleft software in mobile apps.
Got it. No, that makes a ton of sense. And honestly, that was actually really helpful for my own education, selfishly, which I think the vast majority of our audience also appreciated. And this makes me then wonder, what about, embedded systems or, IoT or edge computing, as we were kind of talking about earlier? Any additional nuances when thinking about those distribution models?
Embedded software is one of the most difficult areas for compliance. First of all, it's almost always distributed, because what's happening there is that you've got a physical device and you've got some software on it, and the physical device almost always changes title, and therefore that's a distribution. By the way, there are some nuanced cases where things are rented or deployed in systems for limited use or something. So that gets into some gray areas. However, embedded software tends to be one of the higher risk areas for open source compliance. And in fact, if you look at the compliance actions that take place, they are almost always in the consumer electronics area or otherwise in embedded software. That's a focus of compliance. One of the reasons that it's of particular concern is that if what triggers the requirement to, say, share source code for a distributed software in an embedded product is if somebody who gets the product asks you for the source code, then you have the obligation to provide it if under a copyleft license. And it's easy for enforcers to get their hands on consumer goods, right, in order to test and see what you are doing, whether you're doing it right. Also, there just tends to be more focus because consumer electronics affects so many people. The kind of rate of enforcement in B2B is less, right? But so if you're doing consumer electronics or you're doing electronic systems, those are the situations in which you're going to have the most complicated compliance problems. One of the things that makes compliance difficult in embedded systems is that almost all open source licenses have what I would call notice requirements, meaning you have to deliver a copy of the license. But some electronics literally don't have a screen where you can display that. The old joke is like the Linux toaster, like if you have the Linux toaster, where are you going to put your notices? And I guess you could put them on a CD, but no one, that's the most expensive and difficult way to do it. No one wants to do it. So
Right.
whenever you have embedded software, you've got a lot of additional issues. You've got higher compliance risks, and you've also got some challenges in terms of figuring out how to do your notices. So when you back that into a policy, you've got to be very careful about what you're doing with embedded.
Wow. So it sounds like, embedded systems have, from listening to you, present the most complicated compliance problem up to this point. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, they tend to be complicated, maybe not because it's intellectually difficult to figure out how to comply with the license, but it's just administratively difficult to figure out.
Right. And I think that's actually a perfect segue thinking about this administrative difficulty. As I think about one of the challenges that our customers have as it pertains to interpreting or just understanding policies. And so I'm curious from your perspective, Heather, of what's the right approach for compliance policies when it comes to containerized applications. Specifically, I'm thinking about, obviously the container containing a operating system layer, often, licensed under GPL and is already open source, but then also including the application layer, which is now more than likely proprietary information. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so particularly for the general public license, there are specific rules of interpretation of the license that apply to use of software in operating systems versus user space. And the reason for that is that GPL really was originally written with a view to covering the Linux kernel. And the Linux kernel is largely what's called a monolithic operating system. I mean, it's one big program, right? And so, but on the other hand, the free software advocates who wrote GPL understood that you had to provide some leeway for proprietary applications to run on top of operating systems, or else you were probably going to choke off the applications that would be available for the platform. So there's this specific rule, which, by the way, is not enunciated very well anywhere, that you can kind of draw a dividing line between the operating system space and the user space in order to do license compliance analysis. So everything that's in, say, kernel space for Linux has to be GPL. There are people who would say otherwise, but I don't recommend taking that view. But when you're in user space, you can have proprietary applications, but then you have to analyze how your proprietary applications interact with other GPL code in user space. So the analysis is a little bit different. And these terms can sound confusing, but if you're not an engineer, by the way, engineers get confused by them too. So if you're confused by them, don't think it's because you're not an engineer. But just like if you think about, say, you want to get a program and it says this program runs on this is application XYZ for Linux. This is application XYZ for Windows, for Mac. What that means is that that application has been engineered so that it runs to the specs of the operating system. And the specs of the operating system are, shall we say, like very set in stone. They have to be because it's standardized, right? Otherwise, you couldn't sell applications that you could be confident work on Linux or Windows or Mac, right? So that interface is a very well-defined interface. So when you look at GPL compliance, say, you can look at the compliance for the operating system layer separately from the application layer, and what defines the interface between those is like defines what the difference between kernel space and user space is. By the way, it's sometimes called application space, sometimes user space, sometimes user land.
Right.
But these are also, if they seem difficult to figure out, it's because they are in a way arbitrary. Like
Mhm.
the requirements are arbitrary, but they're standardized, and so you have to ask the question: Are you coding in user space? Are you coding in kernel space? Because they're going to be different rules for compliance for those things. Now, you asked about containers, and the thing is that containers will put together a whole stack of code, from kernel space, maybe even stuff below kernel space, hypervisors and whatnot, and then applications, or maybe language engines and applications on top of them. So there's this whole big stack. And generally, you do compliance analysis separately within each of those layers. So what that means is that containerization doesn't usually change your compliance very much. It mostly changes the way that you distribute the software. The last thing I'll say is that and this isn't as much of a problem as it used to be, but it's a bad idea to just like download containers off the web and use them. Like you really should build them on your own, because otherwise you really don't know what's in them. Now, if you get them from a reputable source and you trust that source to inform you about what's in them and also give you the license compliance information, that's great, you know. But if you just download kind of random containers off the web, you will not know how to do license compliance because you can't unpack them. And
Right.
also from a security point of view, you will not know what's in them. So that's just not a good practice.
I wholeheartedly echo your comments and agree.
I'm glad to hear it.
I think you absolutely want to build your own, we call them golden images, right? And then be able to use that as a standard distribution throughout your organization to know that you're also always building off of a safe image that you've already scanned and,
Yeah.
have obviously evaluated from a license compliance perspective. Um, I think, just one of the last questions that I do want to ask for you as it pertains on the policy creation side is thinking about dependency depth. And, how deep should organizations be thinking about this as we think about, say, direct only dependencies versus transitive dependencies? And are there any nuances between how you handle direct packages versus transitive packages?
Well, first, the bad news is that you have to, if you're distributing code, it doesn't matter whether it's a dependency or not. You have to do license compliance. Um, the usually good news is that the the like the projects, the code bases, the package managers that are extremely widely used are not too bad about figuring out uh, uh, compatibility among dependencies. So for instance, if you're running an open source project and it's under BSD and you put a dependency that is GPL and you don't tell people about that specifically, that is not a good practice, because that's just creating like a licensing landmine. But the well-run projects will not do that kind of thing. They won't create like I call them license bugs. You know, what happens then is that every user is going to have a compliance problem.
Hmm.
The other possibly good news is that if you find a problem that's created by a dependency, you're not alone, right? Particularly if the project is widely used. So you're going to, you're not going to be the only target for compliance. And those kinds of problems tend to get resolved at the project level instead of by individual developers using the code. So if you find that you have a license bug that's created by a dependency, the right thing to do is to go back to the project and say, you need to fix this on your end because you're now causing every developer to inherit this problem. So
Hmm.
there's some safety in numbers, and well managed projects don't create license bugs, but there are a lot of them out there, and unfortunately you can't sort of abdicate responsibility just because something's a dependency.
Absolutely. No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that really kind of goes back to what we were talking earlier as far as a risk professional, you do need to have that full accurate inventory. And that includes every transitive dependency,
Yeah.
in your entire install plan. I think there's a ton of nuances into what is supposed to be included in your install plan and then what is actually included in your install plan, which is why I think it's obviously very important for you to have some automation and you're not doing these things by hand. Um, Heather, one of the things that I think is, kind of transitioning now from just pure policy creation to how do I interpret when I am in violation of certain policies? Specifically, I'm thinking about the case of when a author declares a license, and that is a more permissive license than one that is discovered throughout the package's code base. And if that discovered license happens to have a more restrictive obligations associated with it. How do you handle those type of things, and what's your opinion there?
Well, like I said, that's usually something you can't handle on your own, because you usually, from a functional point of view, you can't create your own version of like a really big package, right? It makes no sense. Like you would have to maintain it on your own and fork it, and that's actually bad from a security point of view. It's bad from a product design point of view. So when you find problems like that, you try to get it resolved upstream from you instead of resolving it yourself. Resolving it yourself is the most difficult and expensive way to do it. Sometimes you have no other option if the project is small, doesn't have any resources, and so forth. But if it's a well-managed project, you should be dealing with the project and trying to fix it. So I'd say that one of the most important things is trying to figure out where to apply your remediation efforts and whether, it's really your problem or it's a community problem.
Absolutely. And I think I hear my takeaway from that is if there are more restrictive obligations in that discovered license, you are held to those.
Yeah.
And it is your responsibility now to either make
Yeah, and
that
that
or do
it's a
something.
good point you make, actually. Like every distributor in the distribution chain is responsible for complying with the licenses. You can't finger point upstream. In fact, there are actually cases saying this. Everybody knew it was true, but there's actually some case law saying it.
Mhm.
Um, as a distributor, you're responsible for complying with the licenses. And if you've used a package that makes it impossible for you to comply because the licenses are incompatible, then you're still responsible. So everyone is responsible for all the code they distribute, whether it's dependency or not.
And I think this is actually a really great follow-up question, thinking about this trend of responsibility, and hearing that everybody in this, development chain, right, are all responsible. Think about a scenario where a license has either been not declared or maybe it's inaccurately declared, and the actual license is, copyleft, where when it claims to actually be very permissive. Who does that burden of responsibility fall onto?
Well, it's really down to the distributor of the code, and that definitely happens. Like people will take code under, say, GPL, and then they'll put it in a BSD product, and they'll never explain that the code came from GPL, and that's really a problem. But I would say that shouldn't happen in projects that have any professional management,
Mhm.
but it's really down to you using the code. You're responsible for it. So it's like the same kind of problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what, my mom would always say, which is it's always your fault. It's your
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Well, I did want to transition us, Heather, into our next, kind of conversation topic, which is thinking about implementing policies. And so, compliance policies are only effective if the engineering teams follow them, frankly. And so, what are some strategies that you've seen be effective in getting engineering teams on board with actually following these compliance policies?
Yeah, so there are some areas of law where having a policy in itself is useful. Like, I'm given to understand that in things like employment law and so forth, like just having a policy can reduce your liability. That doesn't usually work with open source. Like the policy is only as good as people actually following it. So
Absolutely.
the main thing you have to do, if you, let's say you're in a legal role and you're trying to get engineers to follow an open source compliance policy, you have to make it livable for them. I mean, they are dealing with incredible pressure to get products out the door. And if the policy becomes a bottleneck, they will ignore it, because they're going to do their job and get the products out the door. And I think like a few corollaries of that. Um, if you have an organization of any size, you absolutely need automated tools to do compliance. Like a very, very small company might be like doing compliance on a spreadsheet, but that you outgrow that very, very quickly. And if you do it that way, you're just going to have errors and you're not going to be and you're going to cause bottlenecks, or else you're just going to abdicate compliance, which is not good. So the main thing is you have to understand what the engineers are doing and you have to make it easy for them to comply. So one other corollary of that is that the tools that you use need to allow the engineers to interact in the way they're accustomed to interacting. So I have maybe some bad news for little lawyers listening, which is engineers don't like to send emails. Like lawyers love to send emails. Like they love email threads, But when developers interact, they usually want to interact in a structured way. Things like GitHub and so forth that allow them to structure issues, open issues to communicate in ways that have like specific ways of responding. And so the tools have to allow the engineers to interact in that way. And you as a lawyer need to also learn to interact that way. So for instance, one of the big tools to manage development is called Jira. It's like a ticketing system. And you need to learn to use that. And you probably need to learn GitHub too. I'm very sorry, but like you need to learn Git, right?
Yep.
Lawyers can be very resistant because it's a different paradigm, but it's actually in a lot of ways a much more sensible paradigm. So what we used to do 20 years ago with open source compliance is that we would make we would try to make engineers fill out like forms saying, I want to use this software and this is what I'm doing and so forth. That doesn't work at all, right? You need to have a structured way of interacting, and you need to provide tools that dovetail with the other development tools that the engineers are already using. So there's that. Also, the policy cannot be too restrictive. Most of my clients take a kind of middle of the road risk approach to compliance, and I think that's about right. But I've had some clients who have taken very conservative approaches, and it just breaks down because people don't follow the policies anymore. You sort of have to uh, absorb some risk or else you're not going to have people follow the policy. And then the policy has to be pretty clear. So what I usually tell clients is an open source policy should dispose of about 90 to 95% of usage, right? And at a maximum, like 5 to 10% of usage should be escalated to someone other than engineering, like legal, because the decision to use software is primarily an engineering decision. It's not primarily a legal decision. Our role as lawyers is to make sure that the engineers aren't getting into a lot of trouble or trouble down the road, but mostly the decision is an engineering decision. So what you do is you actually allow engineering to make almost all the decisions. You give them guidance, say, here, follow these rules, this policy. If you follow this policy, you never have to talk to legal, right? But if you want an exception to the policy, you have to talk to legal. And then when engineering presents you with a question, you have to respond to them quickly because they are under, extreme time pressure to get things done, just like the lawyers are.
Yep.
So those are the things that I suggest in order to maximize compliance.
Absolutely. And I think you really kind of hit on a topic that I'm always thinking about as a product manager, which is how do I reduce developer friction, right? And how do I make it as easy as possible for, your development team to basically all win together, right? To be on the same team and to make sure that I can help you do less work in the future because you won't have to go rip out these things because you didn't follow the policy, right? Which I think tends to resonate a little bit more.
Yeah.
Um,
You have to remember you're all on the same team. Like
yes.
it's very bad when legal and engineering get at loggerheads and they get, and the lawyers are saying, why are you engineers doing this crazy stuff? And the engineers are saying, why are you lawyers like trying to prevent me from doing my job? And that's really not good.
Exactly. And then, Heather, how do you think about how an organization can handle a scenario where a license is not actually covered by the original policy that they created. Maybe they didn't think about server-side licenses, for example, and then now they come across these, licenses. What workflow or process would you recommend to handle that?
Well, there are always new licenses. There aren't a huge number of new ones, but there are new licenses out there. They come along every once in a while. And the thing is that most new licenses will have a very long tail, meaning that they'll have one or a handful of projects that are covered by that license. Um, just kind of historically, MongoDB was originally covered by a Pharaoh GPL, which is what we call a network copyleft license, which most companies have on their stop list. They won't use code under that license at all. And I would say for the first between like maybe 5 to 8 years that a Pharaoh GPL existed, the only software that was being approved under that license was MongoDB, right? And so what you have to remember is that when you approve the use of software, you have to figure out for your organization whether it makes sense to just approve it once or have a separate approval for every use case within the organization.
Hmm.
But it's just that, like, usually if there's a new license, there's a specific project associated with it, and the decision is going to be driven by how much you want to use that software. Like how much additional risk are you willing to undertake in order to use that software?
Hmm. Hmm. No, that makes a ton of sense. And honestly, Heather, we've gotten a ton of questions already in the chat about this one, so I know this is going to be a hot topic.
Okay.
Which I'm really excited to kind of get your opinion and perspective on. Generative AI, right? Tools obviously have been having their moment. They've been the source of some controversy, though, in the context of software development, in particular, obviously, open source license compliance as well. One of the reasons why is that generative AI is trained on open source libraries. So there's an argument that anything created with generative AI would constitute a derivative work of the libraries upon which the tool is trained. And such would have to comply to things like copyleft licenses. So what's your kind of view on this, Heather?
Well, so this is obviously a hot topic, and also a topic where the law is a little bit vague. And I'll tell you what I think of it, but I want to emphasize that other people might differ on where they come out on this. So I think that the claims that generative AI will create derivative works of the source code that it's trained on mainly misunderstand what machine learning is. Machine learning sucks up a lot of data, and then it creates a model, which is basically a kind of an array of probabilities. So, for instance, everybody's used predictive typing on, say, Gmail or something, and you say, like, you get an email from somebody, and it suggests, thanks for your message, or that sounds fine, or something like that. So what's happening there is that based on what you start writing, or maybe based on the context, the tool is suggesting what it thinks will come next. And that's basically what machine learning is. It's saying, if this thing happens, then this thing is probably going to happen. But that's not the same as saying, well, I've copied this stuff. When you look at copyright law principles, actually, if something just generically happens after something else, then there's no copyright protection of that, because it's not a creative process at all. Moreover, a lot of it is going to be very short stuff, a word, a phrase, a line of code, and there are limitations to copyright doctrines actually that apply to small bits of things that might otherwise be copyrightable works. And then finally, there's, I think, a very good argument that it's fair use. So even if you are actually copying, it falls under the fair use doctrine, which is way too complicated to talk about in the time we have. where I come down on it is that if machine learning models are properly prepared, they should not create infringing output. Because that's just not what they do. They don't copy paste. That's what humans do. Like what ML models do is they say, okay, if this thing comes here, then this thing is going to come next. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, but fundamentally, the output should not be infringing, and so it actually shouldn't matter what licenses are on the input side at all. Now, there is a lawsuit pending. It's class action about GitHub Copilot. And interestingly, that is not a copyright infringement suit. And if we sort of ask why didn't it allege copyright infringement? It alleged all sorts of other stuff, but not copyright infringement. And reading between the lines, I think even the people who filed that lawsuit, realized that they would never win the copyright infringement claim. So, I think largely generative AI should not be infringing if it's done correctly, if it's trained on a big enough data set. Obviously, if you train on too small a data set, yeah, you're going to get a lot of like copying of stuff, but that's
Mhm.
because you didn't train it properly. So what I tell my clients at this point is, this is a risk analysis question. These tools are reportedly unbelievably helpful, like with productivity boosts of 50% or more. You can't ignore that, right?
Right.
And so what you're doing is you're weighing against the risk that the code you're generated is going to be infringing. And what I would say about that is that it's probably not going to be infringing, number
Mhm.
one. Number two, the defendant in that case happens to have an enormous war chest to defend the case. Thank goodness for all of us, because a smaller company might not have had the resources, and they might have settled or capitulated and created a precedent that would be actually dangerous for everyone else.
Absolutely.
So good on the big companies who are willing to fight to death over these copyright issues, because they're the ones who have the resources to do it. And finally, in the worst case scenario where you end up with a code base that is riddled with third-party open source stuff, there is a way to fix that. We actually fix that stuff all the time.
Nice.
So because of that, I say go ahead and use the tools and let the chips fall where they may. There are other kinds of generative AI, by the way, that I have kind of slightly different advice on, but that's kind of my thought about it right now. And it's a very controversial question.
Absolutely, and I think to your point, the technology is obviously outpacing the law at this time, and thus that is creating a lot of gray areas. I'm curious, just to kind of wrap up this question on: do you have any guidance, or do you think that there should be any guidance? Kind of listening to your answer, I almost kind of get the sense that your take is, hey, flag that particular application is using generative AI, and then just let them, kind of run with it and enjoy themselves. But
Well, that's a very good comment, actually. So what I recommend at this, and by the way, this is very similar to what happened with open source 20 years ago. Like open source 20 years ago, lawyers were saying, don't use open source, it's too risky. And in fact, if you said that, the engineers would use it anyway. This is exactly the same. All of your people are using generative AI, and the only question is whether they're doing it or not. So
right, right.
if you're going to develop guidelines, you better develop guidelines that don't tell them just, oh, don't use this stuff, and they'll get left in the dust, right? So my advice to clients about this is, like for Copilot, I would say go ahead and use it. Worst case scenario, we go and remediate everything, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
For things like art, I would say uh, use generative AI, but make sure that you can track what you produced using it. because art, like artwork and music and things like that, those are discrete files. So if they were a problem, you could swap them out, right? But you have to track what you created using the tools. And then things like Chat GPT for marketing materials and stuff like that. My general thought is that stuff's pretty generic and I can't really see a lot of copyright liability for it. But also, like those tools are best used as as tools for humans, not as substitutes for humans. So
Absolutely.
like ChatGPT is, for instance, great to write a first draft of something, but is not terribly good to write the final draft of it, right?
Exactly.
And so if you exercise your own judgment and creativity and you use these things as tools, then you're actually also reducing the copyright liability.
Mhm. No, that makes a ton of sense, Heather. And I did want to spend some time on this one because we just happen to get so many questions in the chat about generative AI and its impacts, and how do you manage that risk. I do want to address in these last 5 minutes some of the questions, some of the other questions that we haven't gotten to
Yeah, let
at this
me
point.
look here.
Absolutely. Take a look.
Let's
While you're
see.
looking at those, Heather, I do just want to answer one for the audience right at the top there. Will any code scanning tool be able to detect the snippets of copyleft open source code in an AI output? And I can just answer that one real quickly from a technical perspective. That is very, very difficult to do. We've spent a lot of time here at FOSSA, analyzing it. We definitely can detect snippets. There is a high false positive rate associated with that. And I strongly believe that any organization that's telling you they can do that with a high degree of confidence is more than likely being a little facetious. But with that, Heather, are there any questions that are really jumping out to you that you'd like to answer?
Yeah, so we have one saying, can you explain some important points to you include in a contract with suppliers from a license compliance viewpoint? I do have a lot of suggestions about this. First of all, if you require suppliers to tell you that they don't use any open source in their products, then they're going to violate that warranty and it will do you no good whatsoever, right? Um, the important thing with suppliers is two things. One, you should expect, as a customer, you should expect a warranty that the product you get is compliant in the form it's handed to you. I mean, that is, there might be exceptions in cases where you're hiring pure development resources and you're really controlling the development. But if you're getting an off the shelf product, you should expect that when it's handed to you, it's compliant. And but the thing is that you can make it not compliant by changing stuff. So don't expect a vendor to make a warranty to you like, I'm not providing you with any code that could ever require you to disclose source code, stuff like that. Those warranties just don't make any sense. You want a compliance warranty and you also want disclosure of the bill of materials so that you can do your due diligence. I think if you get those two things, those are the best things to ask for from a terms and conditions point of view. I also recommend, if you're doing development agreements, that an open source compliance review is part of the acceptance testing process. And the reason I suggest that is that developers don't always know what's going to end up in the product until they're, well down the road of doing development. And so I would say one of the aspects of your acceptance testing should be an open source compliance review.
Absolutely. And it's that strong trust but verify, right? To your point of including that in the acceptance criteria. One of the ones that I thought was particularly interesting, Heather, is uh, can you think about a SaaS offering that have an edge device component where only a portion of the application is distributed? Is that now a distributed system?
Well, the distributed parts are distributed and the SaaS parts probably aren't. So when you
Mhm.
have, like when you create policies for a product, you might have to have more than one policy for the product. Like you might have to have one policy for the behind the firewall stuff, the SaaS stuff, one policy for the stuff that's actually embedded in devices, another for mobile devices, etc. So a specific product within your organization may require separate policies.
Perfect. And then, we have 1 minute left. Heather, one last question for you, if you're, open to it. I think, interesting one around embedded systems that don't have access to a screen. You were kind of talking about that earlier to display the license text. Can a website be used in its place?
So what most of the licenses say does not actually allow you to do that, but sometimes you just have no other choice.
Hmm.
So if you have a product and it's difficult to deliver notices, um, you can put like the open source code, the code itself, or just notices on a website. And most of the licenses say you have to deliver a copy of the license with the product or in the product. I mean, they all say something slightly different. And so delivering on a website doesn't usually, meet that requirement.
Hmm.
However, delivering on a website is much better than doing nothing, right?
Absolutely.
Because if an enforcer is going to go after you and you have done a good job disclosing all of your license notices on a website, they're probably going to pass you by. You're too hard a target. They don't want to have to, argue over the meaning of with the product. Also, I would say just personally that if the product is of a nature that it can only be used with internet access, it's fine to put it on a web page because anyone who gets the product would have access to that. The theory behind requiring text copies of notices within the product uh, in the original drafting of these licenses is an assumption that people don't have internet access. Well, that assumption is untrue today, but I think particularly for a product that's like SaaS product, a product that works with a mobile device or something like that, or something that's an internet based product, then I think sure, fine, put it on a website because it's going to be a lot easier to do.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're at time now, Heather. This has been a crazy, informative session for me. I've learned so much. I've been able to really kind of pick your brain and get an understanding of how to, handle license compliance at scale within an organization. Any closing words that you would like to leave your audience with?
Yeah, first of all, you'll get information about this, but if you want a copy of my book, you can go to my website and sign up. There's a place to sign up for a book update mailing list, which I think send something out about once a year, so I won't spam you. But you can actually download an electronic copy of the book there. I am working on a new edition of the book, which I hope to get out this year. It's always more work than I expect. Um, Also, a couple of other things. I am actually writing a new book about open source, using open source to build businesses, which is a slightly different from kind of general open source licensing. Hopefully that will come out later this year too. We'll see how how much I can get it together. And finally, wanted to mention another pet project of mine, which is I've got this oral history, um, which is called the Free and Open Source Stories Digital Archive. And we are trying to capture the personal oral histories of some of the founders of the open source movement. Would love to have some support in terms of funding, people who want to work on the project, etc. Because I think that it's so important to capture like the personal stories of why people have given themselves to the world in this way. So if you want to know more about that, you'll get some information in the follow up as well. And just thanks to FOSSA for putting on these, extremely professional events and for all of the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to too many of the questions, but anyone wants to contact me afterwards, please feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Thank you. It sounds like I got some good reading to look forward to throughout the rest of this year. I want to thank you for putting this on and for participating with us today, Heather. Thank you, audience, for attending, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Bye bye.